Mr Albanese tells us that a voice to Parliament for Indigenous Australians is just good manners and a straightforward proposal.
What the voice to Parliament does is just do two things. One, recognise Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our Constitution. And secondly, ensure that they'll be consulted and be able to put forward a view on policies that impact them. That's not only good manners, it will lead to better outcomes.
It is anything but. There can only be two possible reasons why he refuses to put the detail of what's involved on the table and explain answers to the hard questions. Either he doesn't know because they haven't done the work, itself a dangerous approach that means he's asking for a blank cheque from Australians, or worse, they know the far-reaching impact it will have and they don't want you to know. And after what I'm about to show you tonight, I think you'll agree with me that it's the latter. There are few precedents for a body like this anywhere in the world. But under the cover of COVID darkness, the Victorian government introduced something that looks an awful lot like it: the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. It's an elected body, but of the 30,000 people eligible to vote in the first election in 2019, only 7%, or about 2,000 people, actually voted. Doesn't really suggest Aboriginal people are busting to get this voice, does it? As few as 43 votes can get you elected to this body. The Assembly meets in the Victorian Legislative Council chamber, just like, for instance, a third chamber of Parliament. Together with the Andrews government, it has established a treaty authority of 5 people, Aboriginal people only, and, wait for it, it will not be required to report to a minister and will have its funding insulated from the usual political cycles. And if you're worried about the cost of Albanese's voice, well, this Victorian setup is funded by taxpayers for initial down payment to the tune of $65 million. And to do what? Well, this is perhaps worse still. According to the Andrews government, it is a significant step towards transferring power and resources to First Peoples so they can control the policies and programs that affect their lives. So, in short, there's a body that has its own elections, meets in the Victorian Parliament, has been provided with substantial funding, and is explicitly designed to negotiate a transfer of power and resources away from the democratically elected government of Victoria. It's also not accountable to a minister, and its funding is separated from the usual channels of democratic accountability. Not only that, the First Peoples Assembly are very clear about what they want to achieve. Changes to current systems and structures of government, having a number of seats in the Victorian Parliament that members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community only can vote for, establishing a permanent representative body with meaningful decision-making powers, what they call a black parliament of sorts, First Peoples oversight of the Victorian government and public service for the benefit of First Peoples. Sheesh, let's be clear about what this means. Aboriginal quotas in Parliament, a black parliament separate from what we already know, oversight of the government and public service, that is, oversight of the executive part of government. And all of this in addition to a treaty. Now, you can read more on this in tomorrow's Australian, a great piece by Joe Kelly, and you don't want to miss it. If the Victorian voice, though, is the closest thing we have to compare to what Albanese is proposing for our nation as a whole, then we should be deeply troubled. Here is a body that is openly setting out its plans, and those plans seek to fundamentally treat people in our democracy differently based only on the colour of their skin. Martin Luther King Jr. wouldn't have gone for that, nor would Nelson Mandela or a whole host of leaders. As Advance Australia have put it, Albanese is not providing detail on the voice because the Victorian voice is what the voice to Parliament is. except that at least in Victoria, the Parliament could repeal the legislation that created it. But Albanese's voice to Parliament will be indelibly written into the Constitution. All I can say is, thank heavens, Peter Dutton and the Coalition have started to tighten the screws on Labor about getting the detail on the table. It's really vital for Australians to understand what they're being asked to do here. But we shouldn't forget, though, for Labor, the voice is just the beginning.
Of course, there are other elements in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. They include truth-telling and treaty, but they come next. They come after the voice is put in our Constitution.
The Uluru Statement, which is Labor's policy, has three components, of which a constitutionally entrenched voice to Parliament is really just step one. Steps 2 and 3 are just as extreme. A national treaty and what they call a truth-telling commission. Treaty is about so much more than just recognising the historical fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were here first. Of course they were. But when you see activists wearing pay the rent t-shirts or demanding the owners of privately owned ships that have washed up on shore to pay 1/3 of the value of the item to the Aboriginal Land Council as a ransom to get it back, like they did earlier this year, you get a sense of it. It's all about the dollars. Now, corporate Australia will get on board because it doesn't come out of their pockets. You know whose it'll come out of? It'll come out of yours. Step 3, which is the Truth-Telling Commission, comes next. Now, the detail on this one's going to be vital. Now, if it's actively collecting Aboriginal history so that future generations can use it and greater cultural appreciation can be gained, then great. But if that's the plan, don't call it truth-telling. Our history to this point might be incomplete, but it is not dishonest. There is a real risk that if it starts up with that tone, it will end up as something of a permanent tribunal for revising history, accepted as truth without reference to other evidence or accounts. And quite frankly, that is positively Orwellian. As with the voice, there's a reason that no details are on the table for Australians to consider. We all care deeply about making sure those Aboriginal people who currently live in fear, violence, substance abuse and poverty have a ladder up. But this? The actual way forward must be guided by the belief that Indigenous people deserve to be treated in all ways as equal to every other Australian. It would be such a mistake to entrench any form of identity politics into our Constitution, not because the role of Indigenous people in this country isn't important, it absolutely is. But the Constitution is a legal and mechanical document, allocating the powers of government. It's not designed to be poetic or cultural. It can't heal wounds and it can't rewrite history. Check it out if you haven't already. There aren't a lot of feelings in there, but feelings are the only thing that voice advocates are selling. It would be far better for us to focus on the deep equality of Indigenous people rather than seeking to elevate or separate them from other Australians.